Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third session of the GCSE Spring Learning Series, Indigenous Knowledge and Western Science, Collaboration, Relationship, and Climate Solutions. My name is Laura Weiland, and I'm part of the team at the Global Council for Science and the Environment, or GCSE, whose mission is focused on advancing evidence-informed decision-making for people and planet. We are honored to be hosting this virtual learning series in partnership with the Land Peace Foundation. And during the past 2 months of this learning series, we have come together from across over 40 countries and territories, which I just added up this morning. It was just wonderful to see that. So with over 1,000 scientists, researchers, academics, students, government agency staff, policymakers, and others from the GCSE community and beyond. Some of you are joining us live, and many others are joining on demand as it fits in your schedules and with your time zones. If there is anyone who would like to learn more about how your institution can formally join GCSE as a member, please feel free to reach out to me, or you can make a note in the reflection form and we'll follow up with you. We have so appreciated the reflections, the deep interest and learning and deep interest in learning and collaboration, and the desire so many of you have expressed to expand your thinking and understanding. This is just such important work, and we really are happy to be in it with you. So I'm going to put the reflection form in the chat again in just a couple minutes. If you haven't already, it really is incredibly helpful for us. If you want to put any more reflections, comments, ideas, this is helping to inform our final session that will come up in 2 weeks, and also informing the development of further opportunities for connection and learning, including a virtual learning series in the fall, which we are going to offer to build on this current series. Our guest presenters and facilitators have offered a lot of useful information and perspectives so far. And we have one more presentation today that we are really looking forward to. Before we begin, I have just a couple of logistics for today and what to expect heading into our final session after this one. This session, like the last two, is being held in Zoom's webinar format. Then our final session in 2 weeks is going to be switching to Zoom's meeting format so that we'll be able to see each other and engage in a more interactive space. We've also opened the chat up for this third session, so we invite you to say hello and introduce yourselves, including your organizational affiliations or where you're coming from today if you'd like. You can put comments in the chat during the presentation, but just like in previous sessions, if you could please use the Q&A function for any questions that you would like to ask the presenters. I want to offer sincere gratitude for my colleagues on the GCSE team, to Sherri, to Darren, to our wonderful guest presenters, and all for the collaborative effort that it's been to organize this series, which we do hope continues to open up conversation and a shared learning space for all of us into the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Darren Ranco, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Chair of Native American Programs and Research at the University of Maine, and to Sherri Mitchell, Indigenous Rights Attorney, author, and Founding Director of the Land Peace Foundation, to get us started. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura, for the introduction, and it's always great to share time and space with you. I'm coming from the base of our sacred mountain, Katahdin, and it's the energy here is just wonderful. I can't, as a Penobscot Nation citizen and connected to this land, it's a really special place to be joining you from. I think we are so excited to continue this discussion that we started with the annual gathering that you all have in January from the Chafee lecture that Sherri and I were able to pull together, our thoughts and frame up this discussion, which we are now in the third session of. There, we went over a few things that are about sort of these zones of engagement around Indigenous science, people experience, climate change. And for me, I highlighted then the need to work on institutional and colonial legacies, as well as the kinds of trust that's needed to build around true research collaboration, and the challenges that Indigenous science poses for ongoing inquiry within Western academic institutions and sort of how science is delivered and taught through various forms of pedagogies. So our first in the series was with Dina Gilio-Whitaker, where she talked about the ongoing colonial and racist legacies of Western science and sort of how that creates challenges for Indigenous peoples worldwide in continuing to respond to things like global climate change. Last session, we had Kyle Powys-White, where he went over the ways that we should understand and frame Indigenous science and its relationships to other forms of knowledge, as well as with humans and non-humans, past, present, and future. And today, we're super excited, of course, to have Linda with us, where she'll talk about some of the possibilities and challenges around partnerships that center Indigenous knowledge and experience. So in our next session, we want to have some active learning and breakout sessions where we can all come together and try to wrestle with this very amazing set of speakers and try to inform our own practices as we go forward out of this series of lectures. So with that brief introduction, I want to also introduce my great friend and colleague and inspiration, Sherri Mitchell. Sherri is a Penobscot lawyer, educator, writer, and activist. She received her law degree from the University of Arizona's Rogers College of Law and has a bachelor's degree from the University of Maine. She speaks and teaches around the world on issues of Indigenous rights, environmental justice, and spiritual change, and is the founding director of the Land Peace Foundation. Full disclosure, I am on the board of this foundation, so I think it's great. As the visionary behind the Healing the Wounds of Turtle Island Global Healing Ceremony, she has also published an amazing book called Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. I have been told that she is working on its sequel, and I suspect it will be just as transformative and amazing as the first book. So Sherri, I'll hand it over to you. It's really great to share space with you.
Thank you, Darren. As always, I'm amused by the fact that you still read an introduction to me whenever you are forced to introduce me. It's been an incredible honor to be able to share this space with all those who have been participating, including Darren, Laura, Dina, Kyle, and now Linda, who has been such an inspiration to, I think, every Indigenous scholar for the last couple of decades. Certainly, I am one of those people who looks to decolonizing methodologies as a kind of a handbook for the majority of the work that I do. And I know that there are a lot of other people who have the same feeling about that this has been something that has been a life raft for many of us to help describe the waters that we've been swimming in for so long. So it's my incredible honor to introduce to you one of my unknown mentors, Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Linda is Ngati Awa and Ngati Puru Maori. She's a scholar of education, and she has been a critic of persistent colonialism in academic teaching and research. And of course, she's best known for her groundbreaking book, which came out originally in 1999, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she traced the history of scientific knowledge as it developed through racist practices and the exploitation of Indigenous peoples. And as we've talked about throughout this series, we've talked about this history of racism in science, and Linda's book was really groundbreaking in that, where she connected disciplines such as biology and anthropology and really debunked and outmoded practices such as phrenology as examples of fields of study that evolved through the exploitation of Indigenous peoples. She's contributed an incredible amount of scholarship since then, has just left a long-term post at Waikato University and is moving on to a new post, which I'm sure she'd be happy to tell you about if you want to ask her in the Q&A. Most recently, she is expanded her work, linking critiques of scientific authority to analysis of colonialism and anti-Maori bias in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's really important to recognize that Decolonizing Methodologies, which was re-released, I believe, in 2012, continues to be one of the most important books on this subject in existence to date. And so it is with incredible humility and an equal amount of respect and honor that I introduce to you Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Linda?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone from New Zealand, from Aotearoa. It's kind of 4:40 in the morning. So wherever you are in the universe, greetings to all of you, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I want to acknowledge a number of things. Firstly, the lands that everyone is situated on, and the story of that land, and the story of the Indigenous peoples of that land. Acknowledge our planet, our Mother Earth. Also acknowledge ourselves, our ancestors, and each other. Also want to acknowledge the fact that we're speaking, or I'm speaking to you in the context of a pandemic, and a pandemic that's had devastating impact around the world, but particularly devastating impact for many Indigenous, minority communities, communities of colour, communities of, disadvantage. And, once again, a sort of crisis of a global scale reminds us of these deep inequalities, inequities that are global. They're not just in a single society. These are global inequities that have global impacts and lock us in to all kinds of situations that I think it becomes a real challenge to undo and navigate different ways of living in relation to each other, of being in relationships. And that's a core, I think, of what I want to talk to you today. But the third thing I want to acknowledge is the recent news from Canada, from Kamloops in British Columbia, of the discovery of the remains of children who attended the residential school, and the huge revisiting of the trauma of that experience. All my colleagues and friends in Canada are grieving again for the loss and the trauma of that particular experience of colonialism. So, people like to think colonialism has gone away. Well, it hasn't gone away. It has, it's taken different forms, but also some of those traditional forms of colonialism, which actually killed us, come back and haunt us. And so, we can't escape that story because it comes up out of the land and reminds us of what has happened, the devastation of Indigenous societies and the devastation of our environments and of our lands as well. So just want to, if any of you are from First Nations in Canada, just want to acknowledge that experience, and just to say that I know here in Aotearoa, my colleagues, we just send you our love, and just know that we share your grief and your loss, but it also drives us to do what we do, to do the kind of work we do. And yeah, I'll just leave that there. But I think it segues really into the responsibility that then comes with this idea of developing meaningful, collaborative, ethical partnerships between science and scientists and organisations and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities. And it rolls off the tongue quite easily, you know, the idea that, oh yes, it's a good thing that we should develop relationships because that's how we can get things done. But I kind of want to unpack that because we're not talking about transactional relationships here. We're talking about really, what does it mean to have a meaningful relationship when power is often in the room and an inequality of power or relations of power that are not equal are also in the room? When the power of history is in the room, the power of language, the power of loss, and the power of grief, the power of this kind of differential power and knowledges between Indigenous knowledge and science, that they are part and parcel of what we have to navigate and what we have to kind of understand we're also building relationships with when we enter into partnerships. Now, I'm going to assume that, you know, many of you working in sort of collaborative projects or have experience in working in communities and building sort of what we call partnerships. So you would have a sense of the nuance of what a being in partnership means and what underpins that partnership, which to me, the more fundamental notion is a notion about relationship. But I also heard Sherri talk about space and sharing space, that relationships occur in context and they do take place in space, in different sorts of spaces. And relationships are never rigid. They're dynamic and they ought to be dynamic, and they grow as we develop trust in each other. You know, hopefully a relationship is enriched and changes and evolves. But having said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other things that are in the room, like relations of power, different histories, different trajectories, different relationships to Indigenous knowledge somehow disappear. I think one of the ethical responsibilities of whether you're a scientist or whether you work in an institution is to always be mindful of the different forms of power that you have in a partnership. You know, one of the one of the powers that many people have that they take for granted is the power to walk away, right? The power to pull out of a project, the power to disengage, the power to be silent. And both sides can exercise that power. Or, you know, if you're in an institution, you actually can do that in ways that have a real impact on communities. But I also know that's often the little bit of power that some of our communities can exercise. They can turn away, they can be silent, they can just do enough to do what needs to be done, but provide nothing more. and give nothing more, and give away nothing more. So relationships with Indigenous communities and with Indigenous knowledge are always going to be challenging, and they ought to be challenging. And I think the responsibility for, not just those of, you who might be scientists, but all of us who work in quite powerful institutions is a responsibility to work in relation with, to work in an ethical relation with both the knowledge of Indigenous peoples, the history of Indigenous peoples, the reality of where Indigenous peoples are at in their social lives, and to think about what is it in a reciprocal sense they gain from any partnership, and how meaningful is that outcome for them. I mean, that's why the power relationships are so important, because often scientists, because you're trained to be clear about what it is you want in a project, have a clearer idea then of what you want to get out of it. Whereas communities, unless they've co-designed that project, have not had that opportunity really to control the outcome of what the good might be that they will gain. And it's very hard to imagine a good when you have a history of being exploited through these partnerships, when you have a history of being let down and disappointed. So it's hard to even imagine a positive outcome. And it's hard to imagine how a relationship itself can deliver positive outcomes, not just the project, which for many researchers, the purpose for the relationship is the project, not the relationship. Whereas I think for Indigenous communities, they come at the relationship as that is the purpose. You get the relationship right, you build the relationship, and then you can do many projects, not just a single project. If you have a trusting relationship, it should lead to all kinds of interesting, exciting and positive outcomes. It's never about a single project or a single purpose. The relationship itself will generate, a range of other outcomes and other possibilities. So a great deal of work has to go into the beginning of building a relationship. And there are different ways that people do this. I know some people kind of just start cold. Who do you talk to? How do you approach a community? It's not really something it's not like a paint by numbers exercise. Even though it might look like an Indigenous community as a structure, they're a nation, they might have a chief or president or a leader or several leaders. They might have committees who deal with certain relationships, though manage relationships, those sorts of things. But that often just works at a surface level in terms of the people who ultimately you need to build the partnership and the relationship with, because they're often not visible the first time you enter a community or the second time, or you take them for granted. They're there, but they could be the grandmothers who are serving you coffee or in the kitchen who are on the periphery. They could be people who are out doing their their work and who you won't get to see until you're able to be out in the environment. And the ones who broker the relationship from the Indigenous community are not always the ones with whom you will ultimately interact. And, you know, that's just one way it works. Another way it works is that person who works in the forest is the one that you know. That's the practical relationship that you have and that you establish, but they're not the tribe. They're not the nation. They can't speak for the others necessarily. So who you have a relationship and then who you build a formal partnership with, I think that's can be quite a complex domain, depending on the context, on whether it's a community base or at a nation and tribal level. So for example, in New Zealand, you know, you can build a relationship with the tribe, the tribal governance authority, the tribe that, you know, is has negotiated, for example, a treaty settlement, and they've been mandated to exercise that settlement. But having a relationship with them does not entitle you to assume a relationship with all the groups and communities who belong to the tribe, who are part of the tribe. And the tribes I come from argue very strongly that the tribe comes from us. So when you meet with the tribe, you're meeting with an entity that represents us, but you still have to negotiate with us if you want, you know, access to our particular parts of the tribal territory. So I think knowing your context then and knowing the journey, that you're going on a journey, and committing to the journey, committing to the kind of unknown element of building a relationship. Because I know, you know, people who are project trained, you want to achieve things. You want to do X, and, you know, week 7, you want to have got this milestone, and, you know, week 27, you want to have attained this milestone. Well, relationships aren't like that. Week 7, you could be going like backwards. And so I think you need, in your sort of ideas about working together, a different kind of project management tool, which is really a relationship management tool. How do you pay attention to the relationship? How do you think about it? Because you're trained to think about these things, but how do you think about it in a different kind of way? And that's just with the people. But there's another relationship, which is with Indigenous knowledge, because you have an important role to play, and you've got to treat it really carefully. You know, why is science interested in Indigenous knowledge? Because it damn near destroyed it. So what then is the responsibility of science in working with these fragile Indigenous knowledge systems? And it seems to me there's this ethical responsibility to help in what we call the revitalization, the regeneration, the putting back together again of Indigenous knowledge, not to tamper with it, not to extract any more from it, but to help it become whole. So while working across knowledges, working at the interface of science and Indigenous knowledge is important, it's really important not to exploit that knowledge, which I think you will all understand, but it's equally important not to assimilate that knowledge and reframe it so that it then can't work again inside its own system because it's been contaminated in a sense. So, you know, I think that's really quite challenging. I don't have easy answers for that because I think it's about our consciousness as researchers and as ones who work in a different sort of Western discipline-bound set of ideas about knowledge and rules about knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is really special, really, really special, really important. And what science is often interested in is a small portion of that knowledge. And what science is really good at doing is selecting what it's interested in and then starting to hone in on that, the unit of it, and beginning to sort of manipulate it, think about how to see it devoid of its relationships in its own context. We're good at examining knowledge in those ways. And I find those practices can be incredibly harmful to Indigenous knowledge and to Indigenous communities. So, you know, why? Well, one reason is it's plucked out often of a wider context in which it lives naturally with those people and in that environment. And in plucking some aspects out, it gives them an honour, if you like, and diminishes other things. So it starts to separate and differentiate in ways that are unnatural, if you like, in the Indigenous context. And for a lot of Indigenous communities, then it means it sort of, it often makes them think differently about what it is. It makes them think, well, maybe that is special. Maybe we do need to focus on that more. So it can force them to reprioritize what's important, but devoid of the context and devoid of the autonomy and the self-determination that they require to make those decisions themselves. So I'm talking about, you know, partnerships at kind of multiple levels, but, you know, ultimately, when we're talking about partnerships, these are people arrangements, and they're often institutional arrangements, and they're often commercial arrangements. And yes, you can make those arrangements, but underneath them are relationships. And I think unless institutions do their relationships better and are more ethical and are prepared to be generous and be reciprocal and be patient and do things differently, then, you know, I think the partnerships simply become transactions. And if you're going to do a transactional partnership, it's best to do it really upfront, clear, so people know not to waste their time with you. And they know that it's a business relationship. Because I think it's really important to be honest with our communities and to not bullshit them, to be honest, to be frank about it in terms of what it is that people are trying to do. So, you know, I come from a New Zealand context. Actually, my family are farmers, and farmers are fairly brutal about partnerships and relationships, and they're not that fond of researchers, scientists, or scholars. they see themselves as scientists. You know, they're making decisions all the time around the care of land and the care of our forest, our waterways, our animals, those sorts of things. They value the scientists who can work in that space, but they have no time for people who waste their time. And they're fairly frank about telling you that. That's kind of different from some of our other communities where they are sometimes flattered by a relationship and are distracted by that relationship. They see something in it that it might give them possibilities that weren't available to them. It might shift the way other people perceive them in the community. So none of us arrive in a partnership in a neutral sense. All of us will have an impact in the kinds of relationships and partnerships that we build. And I think our responsibility is to pay attention to that, not just carry on with our project like this sort of view, but to always kind of notice who's in the room, who's no longer there, who's fallen away, what else do I need to do, and to stop and pause and ask, what's the health of our partnership? Let's have a review. Is it the kind of relationship that you were expecting? Is there something that I am failing to do? Is there something that we have not addressed? I think, you know, in my world, if you're upfront about reviewing and being self-critical and opening yourself up to that kind of examination, it tells people you're paying attention and that you're serious about the relationship and that you're prepared to invest your time in it, because relationships take time. And, you know, for us, we might call it having a cup of tea or staying for a meal, having dinner, eating together is important relationship building. Having a cup of tea with an elder, even though, you know, you're sort of looking at your watch because you need to do something and the cup of tea is taking like 1 hour and a half, those things are hugely valuable and they're very simple to do, and often people overlook that. So I'm just conscious of time. I think it's like 30 minutes, and then I'm really interested in what kinds of questions that you have. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you so much for framing that so well for us. I know that Darren and I both are like with questions, and that audience members are going to have a lot of questions for you as well. And I'm going to let Darren start off with the first question.
Yeah, thanks, Sherri. And Linda, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And, you know, it's strange to not, because I teach your book so often, and you know, there's so much wealth of information in it. And, you know, you talk about the lessons learned of sort of, you know, true partnership talks about an open discussion of worldviews at the beginning of projects, and the process involved in decolonizing that work, and really being self-conscious about the methods that you will be using, and sort of how to, you know, create institutional arrangements that are much more just in that work. One of the classic questions we've been getting all along, as you know, scientists are quite interested in specifics, right, in terms of these stories, and I'm always you know, that kind of extractive work around, you know, including Indigenous people, but only for this piece of knowledge or this piece of information. And, you know, the classic studies that did that are, of course, like in places where, you know, a scientist goes and is doing like a count of, the classic one was counting whales in the Arctic Ocean, or, you know, some of these things where, oh, well, these people are closer to the resource, so they'll know how many of X, Y, or Z things are there. And in fact, that's not the important, from an Indigenous perspective, that might not be the important question, right? Counting the numbers or doing, you know, so this framing, and I guess I'd just love for you to share, because I know in your works, and I've heard you talk about the, you know, the specifics, you know, a story even. I think the stories are really powerful. You know, a story of where this kind of has gone wrong can be, you know, edifying for folks. And I think you've talked about that in different kinds of health research contexts in the past. But I'd love to just sort of hear like a maybe a specific illuminating example in your projects, you know, protecting the innocent, of course, or maybe the guilty as well, in terms of, you know, a specific rendering of that kind of extractive, not really coming together of these sort of collaborations.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's got a lot of names in the Indigenous world. I mean, it's called helicopter research, fly in, fly out. Yeah, there are lots of different sort of terms that are used for that, to describe that sort of extractive, transactional approach to working with Indigenous people. And actually, I had that yesterday. I talked to a woman from the local tribe who'd come into the university. They had asked for all the research the university had on their local wetlands, you know, and there was a team that had done quite a bit of work on different sorts of projects on the wetlands. So they got given and printed off very kindly academic papers, which they then took back to their tribal community, and members of the community started to kind of discuss and, you know, try and make sense of the academic papers that they were given to read. And she came in to see me yesterday, and their summary was, they wrote all this stuff to tell us that our wetland is dead when we can just look out of our kitchen window, you know, and see that it's dead. We don't need all these studies to say something's wrong, because we see it every day, you know, and they just, it's a really good example of the disconnect of what's important, because what they want to know is how to revitalize, how do we bring back our environment, what do we have to do, you know, to solve this, you know, to change what we have to look at every day, because we know it's not healthy. And that happens all the time. I think the priorities that scientists have, that researchers have, are not the priorities that communities might have, even if we're talking about climate change. So just another little example, Darren. I'm just working with my tribe on there's a big call for proposals that are about climate change and Indigenous knowledge. So of course everybody's excited. And then I've been talking to other colleagues and some of our community people, and we all share a river. So we're going, well, you know, what can we do? And the scientists said, yeah, we really, you know, the river's degraded, we need to do all kinds of things. So we had a big brainstorm. And then all the community people said, well, we want to do something about our food. And the scientists were like, you know, like, what are you talking about? What food? it's like our food practices, because we can't eat stuff out of that river anymore. We have to go over there, and our delicacies, they're gone. We have to go to somebody else's place and get what we value from their river, because we can't get it out of our river. So, it sort of went round and round and round, and eventually some of the scientists who were in the brainstorming said, okay, I think I know how we can come together on this. Let's look at our food practices, but let's also look at the ways that communities have adapted. What is it we're having to do because we can't do what we traditionally did, and what does that tell us about all these strategies? So it'll take a while, and it's a messy, awkward conversation. And I could see my science colleagues really kind of being anxious at one level, curious, confused, wanting to help, not knowing how to help, but eventually just kind of relaxing and just letting the conversation flow. And then out of the middle of it pops some interesting ideas that everyone gets excited about. So what's the action that came out of this meeting? Well, the action is, number one, we're going to meet again. So that's a good sign of a relationship forming. Number two, people have said, oh, we need to bring in these ones, we need to bring in these ones, we need to widen the conversation. So it will evolve. And I think it's a good way to start a project, to have Indigenous communities in at the very design of the question. What is it that's important? And how can we together come up with something that's satisfying, but also exciting and meaningful to the community? So we'll see how far it goes. As you know, a lot of proposals never get off the ground. And even if they do, they don't get funded. But if the group can stay together, they will get a project. I'm absolutely sure. There's good people in the room. And part of my job these days is just to bring people together who I think can work together and encourage them, because they recognise they need scientists, our communities, they recognise that. But I'm not sure scientists recognise that they need our communities.
So true, so true.
That really feeds into what I wanted to ask you, which is when we're looking at this, oftentimes you have people within the scientific community who approach Native communities with the intention of partnering, or the asserted intention of partnering, but really what they're looking for is to check a diversity box on their funding source. And then when you start getting into the work, the Native community is kind of pushed aside and the information is devalued. And of course, we can't teach, we can't outline in a book that so easily integrity as we can other forms of scientific methodologies. But that is key to being able to establish the types of relationships that you're talking about, is having that type of integrity. And so when we're looking at people coming into our communities, coming in with an understanding that there's going to need to be a cultural framework, one of the things that when I first went to Waikato, I went to Waikato and to Tiaroa and Taipo, and have had people from those communities come here a few times as well in this sisterhood exchange that we have going on. And we're a matriarchal society. And so for us here in Wabanaki territory, we're matriarchal. In fact, Darren and I did one session together where a man, a scholar who had some position of authority at one point in time, reached out to Darren because he was concerned that I said that there's more than one way of knowing, and didn't approach me about it, but went to the man, not realizing that we're a matriarchal society. And because Darren was raised right within that matriarchal society, he immediately came to me. And so when I first went to Waikato, what I saw was all of the men standing in the middle talking, and none of the women being given voice. And I was like, what is going on over here? You gotta fix this. And my friend, Tipa Mahuta, and a couple of other people that I've become very good friends with said, watch what happens. And so seeing how the way that the women's voices began to be weaved in, and the authority of the women over time, made it apparent to me that I had made a mistake in judgment in my initial, from the outside looking in. And I think that happens so frequently. People from the outside looking in are coming from their own framework, and they're using their own lens to look in, not really recognizing or understanding all of what they see. And so having that cultural framework established at the beginning is in most cases unlikely and impossible. But being open to the establishment and to the understanding and to having that wait time for developing that cultural understanding and awareness in determining who you're going to need to bring to the table is critically important. So the question that I have for you is, how do we initiate processes where there allows space for that, but also where there's an understanding from the outset that the knowledge that's gained is going to be equally weighted? So there's equanimity within the process, so that science doesn't try to take Indigenous knowledge and stuff it into a Western rational framework, that there's an equal weighting for alternative ways of knowing beyond that narrow white male form of rationality to other ways of knowing and understanding the world in which we live. Do you have suggestions for equalizing that weighting at the outset of these relationships?
I've seen it work, but it requires particular kinds of amazing scientists who have long-term relationships with our communities, who are trusted. I've also seen it not work because everybody got just frustrated. And then everyone recognized can't do anything. And that's the problem with the tick the box exercise as well, that, I think communities, there's always, that for us, that's often the role of the women, is that intuition about, we're going to get ripped off here. We don't trust these people. That sort of intuitive response often is at play in a room, even though people aren't talking. And then in our context, they become very, very polite. And when a bunch of Māori are very, very polite, it means we're all trying to figure out how to get the hell out of there and, disengage, because they've realised that you can't go any further in the relationship. So it's hard, Sherri. The sad thing is, I can probably tell you more horror stories than positive stories. But I know there are positive stories, and I know some of our communities have sustained relationships to the point now where the power has shifted. So instead of the researcher having to come to the community to, say, let's do this piece of work, the community are writing their own research proposals, and they're ringing up the scientists saying, hey, we're applying for some funding for our river. Will you join us? And to me, when that happens, that's a sign of a reciprocity at work, is that a number of things have transferred. The community people have been taught by the scientists to stand up their own proposals, to design them themselves. And they've been given the respect by that group of scientists they work with to be independent. They have publications because the scientists have put them on their publications, and then they are first author on some publications because they've worked with a team who've helped facilitate their growth as really independent community-based researchers. I mean, they're publishing in community research journals, not necessarily in the science ones, but they're getting a track record. They're able to apply for certain sorts of funding. So when it does work, it's magical, it's long-term, they are genuine relationships, but there's not enough of those stories.
Thank you so much. I want to begin some of the questions that have been coming in, and also just maybe first say that, you know, when you were framing that first piece around the purpose of the project is the relationship, and just the reframing that like the relationship is the most real piece, it just feels so central to everything. And you know, it's amazing how much you can lose sight of that if you're not putting that frame, but it changes everything. I just, somehow it just really struck me. I thank you so much for that. So one question, and there's several of them that's coming in, is, you know, especially because it is, you know, it is about a real relationship, and you know, recognizing the relationships that are one-on-one as well. So how do you, can you speak a little bit to recommend what you would recommend around building relationships with whole teams? You know, when somebody's just asking about that piece, is, you know, can it ever be anything other than very personal to one-on-one relationships?
Well, anything that's beyond one-on-one becomes more and more complicated. Group relationships, group dynamics, they're complicated. Community relationships, they're complicated. You know, it just escalates, or the scale of it becomes more challenging, and which means that whoever the leader of a project is really does have to spend a lot of time. And you have to build processes that are about relationships into your processes. You know, whether it's meetings, whether it's, you know, little well-being exercises where everyone comes together and checking out how everybody feels, you know, and pay attention to feelings. You know, often researchers like, no, we're all about, you know, doing what we're the tasks. We forget the feelings, and we forget that even the student intern on a project sometimes has an insight and an experience which needs to be shared.
That sort of relates to another question, which is from someone who has said, we've started a regional network with 2 tribal governments and communities as partners. One thing that we're trying to do is to decentralize our introductions, decredentialize our introductions into each other and how we describe ourselves. Do you have any suggestions for how we start our conversations if it's not, hi, I went to this university, or, you know, what, I studied this or that?
Well, just don't do it and see what happens. You know, I mean, there are alternatives, and every Indigenous culture has a way of introducing themselves and being together, and we do it by our mountains and our rivers and those sorts of things. You can develop protocols, but then I think there's a lot of, what do you call them, when groups get together and they do all these starter activities so that everyone gets to know each other. And when groups do that, I know my community get really uncomfortable because they don't like playing games. You know, they think, why are they doing that? so it can be really awkward. I think if you're trying to do something different, it's like, okay, let's be different. Let's start out and see where it takes us. Because as I said, it's a journey. And the thing with a journey is sometimes, you don't go very far. You stumble. You just pick yourselves up, figure out what went wrong, and then you carry on to the next step. That's the point about a relationship, is how do you grow together? Not how is one person the boss of the other.
There's another question that was in the chat that I know is very important just from my own experience. And somebody is asking, how do you manage relationships when you're going to elders and others within the community? And it looks like you might be bypassing leadership because we have here consultation requirements in the United States, and they're nation to nation. And so there was a group of us, and the elected leaders don't always represent the traditional people, the ones who are holding the traditional knowledge and the ceremonies and way of life. And so we fought really hard to get Executive Order 1301, which allows for the voices of the spiritual elders to be included in that consultation language. So somebody's asking about, how do you manage that when you go into a community and you may not have favorable leadership or fair, equitable leadership. And so you're trying to go to the people to make sure that you have equitable representation and the tensions that it creates in the community. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage that? Because that's a very real problem.
It is a problem. And I think, the last thing you want to do is to be seen to be short-circuiting protocols. And I know some of the big project teams I'm in, that's often my role, is to go and meet with all the significant people you're meant to meet with. And then other members of the team, meet at the next level, the sort of managers of organizations. And then we have elders in our projects. We always have cultural elders in our significant research projects, and they then can meet with whoever they want, because tribes won't stop an elder interacting. So there is a structure, I think, that a formal structure of a project team that you can develop to map the formal structure of a community or nation, and that you do have to have the right conversations in order to get access to the next layer and the next layer. I think if it's complicated and there's a lot of, what do you call them, gatekeepers, people really preventing things from happening, then you have to make a decision, because it's a hugely political decision about what do you do in terms of circumventing the formal process, because the cost can be high. You can get kicked out. And so I think that becomes a really important leadership discussion. And it can also be a problem you can take to the tribal governance. We have a problem. We can't get to the people we're needing to speak to, and try and share the problem with them and see if they can come up with some solutions. And I don't think it's easy, Sherri. As you know, nothing's really straightforward.
I have a very funny story that's very quick that I'll share with you about my first time in Waikato. I was invited over there because we're Penobscot, and we live on the Penobscot River in relationship with the Penobscot land. So we have that same kind of connection that Waikato does to the Waikato River. And so I was invited over there to speak. I got in late the afternoon before, and I was the first speaker in the morning the next day at the water conference. And so I did my speech, and I was very emotional about how much we love the Penobscot River and about being riverine culture. And when I was finished, an elder stood up in the audience and she sang for me. And I was like, wow, I must have done a really good job. I must have touched her heart with my heartfelt stories. And I felt like, I was a big deal. And I went and I sat down and I was all emotional. And then the next person spoke and somebody stood up and sang for them. And then the next person spoke and somebody stood up and sang for them. And I realized, oh, this is a cultural thing. I'm really not that special. So that was kind of my humble introduction to the beautiful customs in Waikato. So I wanted to share that story. And I think Darren has a question for you next.
Yep.
Great story. I mean, I'm seeing there's a couple of questions that touching on this, but I mean, in terms of, the long-term relationships, one of the things, and one of my jobs for the University of Maine is coordinator of Native American research. But what does that mean? It's similar to some of the work you're talking about, Linda, in terms of, kind of trying to onboard scientists into a mindset where they actually can collaborate. I think, some of it is, and one of the, and you've written about this as well. One of the things that's so interesting is that scientists assume in a way that they don't have an identity tied to how they relate to their knowledge. Like I think they assume they're sort of blank slates and not invested. And it's like us as the indigenous people, we're the ones that are all invested in this. And so they enter it, through that lens, not realizing that their identities are very tied to being in that role, right? Being quote unquote objective or being in service to knowledge in a particular way. And one thing that I try to orient them to is being in service to the relationships, the land, indigenous communities, right? And reorienting them that way, which is difficult because, people's identities are not, all that fluid in that way, to be like, now value this other thing that you hadn't thought about until last week. And that's why it's sort of, with some of those best practices, I think of like, going out into the lands with the harvesters, with the people who are in the, I think getting, the more we can get the scientists away from their comfort spaces of their authority and into places where they can be both, I'm not saying don't be an expert, but they can be both learner and expert and be in service to something outside of themselves in their training. It strikes me that, those are the kinds of things. So I'm wondering if you found any of those tricks I've been struggling with to reorient people who are great people. I mean, you talked about, most people want to do it the right way, but they don't realize that they're kind of caught on these particular hang-ups or whatever, their own investments in identity that they don't see as investments or something like that. How do you try to onboard people from the university science side in that way?
Well, I mean, the first thing is all scientists have subjectivity. They're often just not taught to examine that and be conscious of that. And I think what's intriguing now is that, many scientists are having to also become more social scientists and understanding relationships and people, which are not necessarily what they're trained to do and may not be some of them predisposed to do naturally, find it kind of uncomfortable. But if they're going to be doing this work, then they need to do what they know you do in science, which is you prepare, you train, you get the tools, you sort yourself out, you do the homework. You don't just rock into a community and think, well, I'm a scientist, they're going to all fall over, because they won't. So, to me, it's like, do the homework, do the work, and then seek some advice, learn, be prepared to learn, be prepared to be knocked back. You know, why should they think that they get the easy pass into our communities? Because you can't just walk into big corporates and do that. You can't walk into a country, you know, and do big projects in a country without preparing, without sorting the context out, preparing yourself. So, you know, I think scientists over decades and generations have been taught to devalue us, to devalue our communities. And because they don't value our communities, they don't value what that means to build a relationship with us. Because if you were taught to value us, you would know, hey, we better get organised. You know, we need to understand this community and we need to do our homework. I just think it's as simple as that. It's a form of respect.
Yeah, you know, there's another question here that I think is very related. A question about what about nonprofits and other organizations that may have funding for a limited amount of time. But when you think about the context of it's not about the one project, it's about the wider relationship and the fact that you might have to put in time beyond what you're funded for. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, it doesn't matter whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, or I think the same rules apply building relationships. You know, I mean, if you're interested in a field, like I work with nonprofits in the area of domestic violence, all right, they know their communities. They relate to their communities, and that includes the police. So when I've come in to say, do you want to participate in this research project? They immediately think we want to, our community wants to. And so through them, you know, I get to work with their stakeholder groups, their communities, and then, you know, what I've got to learn is to honour that these relationships are really important to them. They're not my relationships, they're their relationships. And so because I've got a good relationship with this organisation, it means they've invited me into their relationships. And I think that's what comes with, you know, being able to work with over time with communities, because when they trust you, they open up not just the door to themselves, but they actually invite you into all their other relationships. But that takes time, and sometimes you don't have funding for a project, but it's easy enough to keep them connected to the work that you do.
There was a question actually leading into this that had to do, and this might be for all of you, just a general question about creating a more inclusive education and learning environment in predominantly white institutions. Just how do we get there, and what would be a good model for critical mass of Indigenous faculty at an institution like that?
We're all grappling with that. I don't think any of us have the answer. But basically, we need institutions to employ our people. And then to be non-racist places, because that's one of the challenges is, you know, universities are racist, and a lot of science organisations are fundamentally racist. So even if you have an Indigenous people or people of colour in those organisations, they're not safe places to be. And, you know, I've been in contexts where there's no way I'll bring my tribal relationships into this toxic environment, because I know what will happen to them. You know, someone else will say, oh, you know, here they are, I want to do something with them, and next minute they're getting ripped off. So it's a really challenging environment. And, you know, it's really what sits behind the decolonizing methodologies work, is that all these institutions are connected. You know, it's not just universities, it's the whole apparatus of knowledge in the Western kind of academy. It's learned societies, it's private organizations who fund research. It's the big research institutes, the federal ones, the, you know, local ones. They're all interconnected. They feed off each other. They scratch each other's backs. They legitimate each other, validate what each other does. And so it's when you're different, if you're Indigenous, if you're brown, if you're Black, you know, you can't fit in those spaces. They're really hard. And you have to build a cluster of support. You know, one by one, we break into them. Then we try and drag other people through the door, and then we drag someone else through the door, but it's this one by one against the multitude. And, you know, there we might get just a little opening of a space that becomes quite safe and joyous, and you get on with things, then it gets restructured. Then you have to start again. You know, so it's been our struggle.
Darren, did you want to add something? Yeah.
Well, no, and I think, you know, where I go in terms of building and transforming a place like the University of Maine, which we have so far to go. We've gotten, you know, thanks to Sherri and other people's help as well, including her grandfather, who started sort of the entirety of our Indigenous programs at our university. That we, there's an onus, right? There is a responsibility by these institutions to learn and recognize and reckon with these racist pasts. Goes back to our first talk, but then, you know, it's not to, you know, that's not just as a like make people feel guilty or bad. I mean, the actions out of that is precisely like a responsibility to build institutions that serve Indigenous communities through research, right? A responsibility to not, you know, have helicopter mosquito research relationships, and that, you know, even the nonprofits, and Sherri and I are working with one that's a local, the Sewell Foundation, where they're like, you know, they have some new leadership, and they're like, well, maybe let's not do like a project by project orientation where it's like money today and gone tomorrow for a project, but no, we want to think long term with partners over successive generations. That's how you build and transform. You don't do it with a single grant or a single project, right? And so, you know, the question of how do you bring that to scale, and how do you, I mean, these are, you know, what I think is great, and why I think Sherri and I wanted to do this with an organization like GCSE, is that we recognize that the people on here are practitioners, frontline, they're Indigenous people, they're doing all this, but some of them sit on panels, some of them are making decisions around nonprofits and scientific agencies and NGOs that can reformulate, right, those past practices that don't work, you know, and if anything, they feel like they're, you know, sustaining the inequities. They at times it feels very much like, oh, we'll add the Indigenous partner, but it doesn't really, it's like trickle down economics or something. It doesn't quite trickle down, except for the person who was employed for that project for that amount of time. So I think, you know, this onus of responsibility, you know, I want, you know, with the 215 children, with, you know, those recognitions, the actions are deep and structural out of that. Out of our collective work is structural and sustained. So I think that's where I would love to see this push. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure Sherri has more to say about that. She's better at this than I am. But yeah, I just think like that's that's the pivot, around it.
I think that one of the great challenges for these institutions is to not only bring in diverse names, but diverse ideas. And so one of the things is that they bring in diversity of scholars, but then they expect them to be homogenized into the way of thinking of the academy. And so if we really want to create change, and we need to not only bring in the diverse names and the diverse bodies, but also their body of knowledge and ways of knowing and being, and be able to apply them to whatever's happening within the academy. That's a big step. And so my organization, the Land Peace Foundation, we have a fellowship program called the Wabanaki Leadership Institute, a 2-year fellowship program that's hosted at the University of Maine, but it's seated in the Land Peace Foundation because we didn't want to have to credentialize our application process to meet academic standards. We wanted to have the full range of Indigenous knowledge and intergenerational knowledge represented within our cohort. And so we have a partnership with the University of Maine, and we are hosting a number of events in collaboration with the University of Maine, but we left the program seated in the nonprofit so that it could authentically be what it is, rather than trying to homogenize it into another Western academic program. And so I think you have to be creative and courageous. And so if you're going to be able to make changes, then you have to be willing to stand for those changes as an institution, as well as stand for the individuals that you're bringing in. So those are two things that I think would be helpful in making those types of transformations.
Linda, I wanted to take you back to something that you were talking about I think you were talking about the responsibility of science and the ethical responsibility of putting things back together and helping it become whole. And I just wondered if you have any examples of when that's worked well, or if you have any ideas about like what you would like that to look like.
I'm just trying to think that, language revitalization is a good example, I think, because especially in the New Zealand context, we've been in this sort of revitalization of the Māori language now for several decades, probably about 4 decades. I'm not talking about a short-term kind of approach to knowledge. And I think what our language revitalization has taught us over the decades is it's helped us unlock some of the elements that have then led to the revitalization of other aspects of our culture. And it's led us to the revitalization or the vitalization, the creation of new activities. So, for example, Māori popular music is huge in New Zealand. And we have many popular artists who sing and compose in the Māori language. Growing up, that's not what I ever heard on a radio. But now we have, this vibrant music scene, vibrant art scene, vibrant, environmental scene, So one core thing can lead to the development of others. So if we bring that back down, then what's the role of science? Well, when we started our language revitalization activities intentionally, it was a linguist, Richard Benton, who developed a study to discover the health of the Māori language. And one of the cool things he did is he got a lot of Māori involved who went out and surveyed their own communities. So he did this in the 1970s. And all those who were involved in the project in taking the survey to their communities became language activists. because immediately they, the evidence was fairly overpowering that our language was dying. And so this was one man, who was passionate about the Māori language, one linguist who developed and inspired really a generation to think about solutions. And it was because of the way he framed his research. He wasn't going in actually with a deficit framing. He was thinking, where's the health of the Māori language? Because he identified communities where it was still a community language, whereas other linguists were busy plotting the demise of the Māori language. I mean, some disciplines were set up virtually to map our death, the death of this part of the culture and the dying of this and the erasure of that. That's what drove some disciplines. And so it's about, stepping out of that tradition and really trying to frame research and frame questions that people can see their future in. Because if they can see their future in it, they can start to put things together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm seeing a question in there for Sherri that was also relating back to something else. Do you see that, Sherri? Do you want to, and then we'll do some final thoughts. Thank you so much, Linda.
I just want to mention, Linda, that Tom Roa, who is a Maori linguist and a beautiful elder, was one of the favorite people that I met, and he's been here to Wabanaki territory. And we talk about and have talked about many times with our friends from Waikato and from the other communities about how our language is relational and instructional in nature. And so it instructs us how to live in relationship. So what we've seen with our own youth is when they're regaining language skills, when they're being taught in the language, that the way that they relate to their community changes, the way that they care about the issues that are facing us changes, the way they care about cultural continuity changes. All of those things change just by virtue of them being taught the language and nothing else. And so it's really critically important. So just to speak briefly to that question, because I don't want to take up a lot of time, and we can discuss this in greater detail in the last session on June 16th. In regard to climate change solutions in the work that I do, outside of this being oftentimes framed within a colonial capitalist model. So taking Indigenous populations that are on the front lines of climate change impacts and trying to move them out of their traditional way of being into a capitalistic market framework in order to mitigate and adapt them to climate change is just one of the most absurd things that I've ever heard in my life. And it's something that we all need to be working to dismantle, this notion that the same tools that brought us to this place can be utilized to solve the problems that have been created under this framework. And so people have to recognize that it's been mainstream thinking that has led us to the brink of extinction, and it is not going to be mainstream thinking that's going to move us away from the brink of extinction. And this is why we need to be bringing in thinking that is not homogenized and filtered into the Western narrow thought model, but something that expands the mind, frees people from their mental slavery, and moves us into a new way of being in relationship with not only one another, but with Nigweskiktimik or Mother Earth. So we can address that question more deeply in the fourth session if it needs to come up. So
thank you. And Sherri, since we're with you, if you have any other final thoughts, and then maybe we'll go to Darren and then end with Linda, and then I just have some quick logistics.
I just want to say that it's to Linda, it's been an incredible honor for me to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you. And I hope that we get to sit down together and have tea when I come back over to that territory next spring. And I'm so thankful that we've had this incredible opportunity to bring a brief bit of your knowledge to this larger audience and to introduce them to you. And I encourage every one of those watching, listening, and who watches the recording to make sure that you have on your desk at all times Linda's book, Decolonizing Methodologies. And so thank you so much for giving us this time at 4:30 in the morning, and for it being not only present, but, you know, on and focused and brilliant as we expected you to be. So from my heart to yours, I just want to say Kachiwali one. Thank you so much, and kia ora, Linda.
Yeah, similarly, just thank you so much for your time and sharing some space with us. And it's you know, there's so much behind so many of the things you're saying, and I'm hoping that we can mobilize that in ways across this community and others. So to do that change that we all know needs to happen. So I really appreciate your time. And so, you know, so the last time I saw you was the 2005 in Hamilton at Whipsy. So maybe Sherri will bring me along when she goes next time down to Aotearoa. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, Linda, do you have any final words? And then I will just close out with just a quick logistic.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and hopefully to those who've participated, haven't been able to see your faces, but I hope that the talk and the conversation has been useful. I just want to emphasize it as part of this journey that you're all on and have committed to be on, and yeah, give yourselves time to learn, take time, and don't think you've got to be perfect. You know, this is not the sort of, you don't have to be an overachiever in this space. That's not what it's about, is it? It's about deep learning and taking some risks in an epistemological sense, and grapple with issues and be prepared to not get it right sometimes, but learn from it.
Well, I also can't thank you enough, especially for getting up so early. But, you know, one thing that really sticks with me is this idea of you saying, you know, ask what's the health of our partnership, you know, like stop and actually review that. You know, that's good for us, for anyone, not just working with Indigenous communities, but just, you know, thank you so much for all of what you've shared. And I think it really will be wonderful to bring that into the next session. So just for everybody to remember that in 2 weeks, we will be meeting and we will be able to see each other, which will be wonderful. I put the reflection form in the chat. So please do, you know, continue to tell us what you're thinking and any reflections that you do have. And we will be sending out this recording next week as well. So I know some people have still been asking about that, and we'll remind you about where to find the sessions 1 and 2 as well. So again, just thank you so much to everyone for being here, and Linda especially, and Darren and Sherri also for just everything that you're bringing. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay.
Have a good rest, Linda.